the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our discussion today, we just want to mention we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. We've got some additional content from reading groups available for patrons, and we have also made our Discord server available. So if you're enjoying what we're doing, you might want to consider donating that $1 a month to the cause, a good cause, so to speak. Today, Taylor and I are going to be diving back into some Sigmund Freud, specifically a real short piece titled On the Universal Tendency to Debasement in the Sphere of Love. My first question would be for you is just generally what made you suggest this reading other than its length, which often I don't have as much time these most recent several months to devote to a lot of reading. So aside from that, what kind of caught your fancy for this?
Yeah, I mean, so he's writing pre-war years, right? So is it labeled 1912?
I thought
right before the First World War.
I don't know if it's the publication date on the PDF I have said 1922. So I guess that's pre WW2, but that's post World War I. So maybe he wrote it actually before.
He may have written it earlier. I got to look.
That would be good to know because
I
definitely feel like this is Freud from a very conservative Freud for sure, as far as sexuality is concerned.
Yes.
Do you disagree? You paused. Was that a disagreement, or are you just kind of digging
No. I'm not disagreeing with you. I was looking
for the actual date it was written itself rather than published.
Yeah, I'll have to double check. Maybe he did write it in the 20s, and I I guess, okay, so we've done some of, I guess in 1922, this would have been, gosh, that feels late. This would have been after Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which seems surprising. So I do need to figure out the actual date. I would have to look at the standard edition to get the editorial from Strachey on it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I do feel like we've done some longer pieces by Freud that covered some material in this realm, like a few years back when we did the narcissism essay, and this covers some of that terrain. And also, I do feel like we've covered Freud discussing the topic of love, but in a more clinical setting when he's thinking through the relationship between the analyst and the analysand, and articulating how a lot of times the patient, the analysand, will through countertransference, or the analysand through transference, and the analyst through countertransference might develop these affectionate feelings. And Freud wants in the training of analysts to be aware that they aren't some Casanova Don Juan. They're not the fucking belle of the ball. That in fact, this is just one last attempt to, as the analysis gets closer to the kernel of repression, right, to sort of throw out another detour and throw things off track by developing these, and you know the meme, Lacan saying transference is love. Lacan himself is kind of taking Freud at his word, right? That there is a love symptom, if you will, a symptomatic love that develops, and that is transference. In any case, so Freud is, he's got a couple of contributions on this topic of love outside of the technical papers that I just mentioned that we discussed a couple of years back. And I think that one thing that I wanted to revisit with you that comes out in much broader detail in the narcissism essay is Freud presupposing what Strachey translates as the analytic object, the analytic type of object relation, right? And by anaclitic, what he means is what Freud briefly describes in the opening paragraphs of the essay, where in our childhood sexual life, there is an interplay between the self-preservative instincts, relying on others and our helplessness to care for us and raise us. The self-preservative drive is, if you will, propping up sexual drive, like leans on the self-preservative drive. And then they diverge later after our sort of initial childhood helplessness. But so Freud takes this kind of as an axiom in this paper, and he doesn't really give it much. He doesn't really provide the reader with much more than asserting it as a fact, which would then seem to indicate he's already published the narcissism paper. Because obviously the other type of sexual object relation would be narcissistic rather than anaclitic. So I thought it would be interesting to discuss some of that presupposition here, because it also axiomatically taken leads Freud to the consideration of incest, the sort of barrier psychically, culturally, sexually against incest. And these two presuppositions allow him to work out this theory of psychical impotence. So that's kind of an overview of why I thought it would be an interesting paper to look at, because it's less than 10 pages, like single space, but yeah, it's about 6 to 8 pages. So it's a quick read. It shows Freud at, I wouldn't say his best, but it shows Freud at his most stereotypically Freudian. And I'm wondering whether or not there's room to not just work out some of the theoretical implications, like in the anaclitic object type, right? This notion of propping or leaning that we've discussed in, for example, reading Laplanche, but also pushing back against some of the things he seems to take axiomatically. For example, is bringing up very offhandedly this notion of class, which I think would be interesting to build up to. So those are just a few of the things. I thought it'd be cool to deep dive into a very short piece that we might be able to like unpack Freud, but maybe also subvert him a little bit.
So yeah, I was definitely thinking, it's whenever you were talking about previous Freud that we investigated that had relevance here, the essay on narcissism was the first that came up to my mind. I was also thinking Laplanche as well, as you kind of preempted. Now, I don't know, maybe I should just dive into this quote, because this quote, I think really, to me...
Yeah, please.
Like, the sort of interpersonal, like, let's say, analysis of impotence, because this is kind of like an essay that's focusing on this phenomenon, let's say, of male sexuality, where effectively, due to the Oedipus complex and this sort of, like the kind of, maybe you would say ambivalence. Would ambivalence be the good way to describe the child's relationship to the mother, in terms of being like this ideal love object, but then also structuring the sexual desire element, which you mentioned about the propping up of the different, I don't know how I would say, maybe avenues or whatever. Like there's the self-preservative drive and the other drive that I'm blanking on at the moment.
The sexual drive.
Right. So,
and I think ambivalence is the proper term. I know he doesn't say the word himself, but yes, ambivalence is key here.
So at this interpersonal level of desire, seeking an explanation for psychologically motivated impotence, where the man or the male desire, they effectively see the love object, the woman, as this, like this is where the kind of prohibition against incest pops up as a, let's say, something that mediates desire. So whenever the man somehow unconsciously views their lover or love object as having this attachment to the mother or the sister or what have you, that can create the issue of psychological impotence, right? So that's kind of a majority of the text really focuses on that psychological relationship, really the structuration, the way that the Oedipal complex structures desire. I say specifically on from the male perspective or the man's perspective. But there's one real interest, just one little kind of quote here that I think is really the most fascinating and has larger implications. And I think those implications certainly flow into pieces like Anti-Oedipus, which we've discussed, Girard's work as well, Girard, Lacan, also Lyotard. So I'm going to go ahead and read the little paragraph that really, this got me going. This is like was the hook for the whole essay. An obstacle is required in order to heighten libido, and where natural resistances to satisfaction have not been sufficient, men have at all times erected conventional ones so as to be able to enjoy love. This is both true of individuals and of nations. In times in which there are no difficulties standing in the way of sexual satisfaction, such as during the decline of the ancient civilizations, love became worthless and life empty, and strong reaction formations were required to restore indispensable affective values. And then he goes on to say how Christianity in particular was able to elevate love in this kind of transcendental way in a fashion that, what was it? Like, God, I'm blanking on the type of religion. Paganism. So paganism wasn't able to deal with this necessity that, at least from Freud's perspective, this obstacle issue, this like mediation is not something that can be overcome. Like he universalizes the necessity of the resistance, of the blockage, of the obstacle, of the mediation in terms of desire. So Christianity is more effective as a libidinal at regulating libidinal economy in this way than paganism, which seems like, at least one would presuppose that the flows of desire are more open and unstructured, let's say. So I said a lot there. I'll be interested just to see what you have to say just after hearing that paragraph again.
This is great. I'm so glad you jumped here, because the end of the essay, we get, and you brought up Anti-Oedipus, we get another quintessential Freudian theory of love, of sexuality, of, let's say, of one benefit of, let's say, I don't want to use the word repression, but suppression. Because here we're talking about obstacles lying in the way, not just quote unquote natural ones, but even conventional ones. And obviously repression has to do with the unconscious, whereas suppression can be conscious, can be also collective. We're talking about these barriers, right? And Freud wants to kind of say at the end of the essay, like, hey, why would, and he says men, but here the German might be just people. But again, knowing that Freud's essay is about men and their impotence, why would men ever endeavor to create great works of art and beauty and these monuments of cultural creation if they had at all times direct and immediate sexual gratification, right? This is Freud's theory of sublimation, that if the libidinal forces were not forced to be channeled outside of a direct fulfillment in the sexual object through sublimation, would culture ever really achieve anything great? This is kind of Freud's way of arguing about sublimation. Now, we know, as I brought up Anti-Oedipus, for Deleuze and Guattari, they would argue, on the contrary, all of these great monuments of culture that Freud is thinking are the product of a kind of desexualized libido are in fact just as suffused sexually as a everyday sexual encounter. Now,
which is funny because I mean, there's still like a kernel in both, right? In that, I don't know, their fidelity to Freud and the critique of Freud, I think, is just interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Because by Freud's own logic, like, it does absolutely make sense. Like, he's literally saying, I mean, they're kind of literally saying the same exact thing, but drawing different conclusions from it, maybe, or if that makes sense, right? It's like they're both saying like this, or they're, at least from Deleuze and Guattari's perspective, they're trying to break down this sort of barrier between desire as being repressed versus it, whatever, it flowing more freely or what have you, and sort of being maybe working to, perhaps to kind of bring down, the centrality of desire seems like is key to both perspectives, let's say, right? Because Freud's saying it's because of this repression of sexual desire that all these cultural objects are happening, which in its own way is an admission that, yes, this stuff is it's literally suffused with desire. It's not being repressed in the way that Freud's You know what I mean? They're drawing different conclusions from a sort of similar phenomenon, or I don't know, an acknowledgement of the centrality of desire itself. If that's making maybe that's just too
No,
pedestrian
no, no,
of a
no, no.
point to bring up,
It's
but
not pedestrian. In fact, it goes back to what we discussed with Charles. I know we didn't read the passage in full, but I said that my favorite paragraph in Plateau 7, of A Thousand Plateaus, the how does one make oneself body with organs? The chapter is where they say that it's always a priest behind desire being, I don't think they use the word repressed, but and they might as well. But it's always a priest that is behind the three different ways of detracking desire from its imminent conclusions or its imminent inner workings, right? So one is to tie it to an extrinsic transcendent ideal, but the second is to tie it to pleasure. And Freud is actually kind of agreeing with Deleuze and Guattari here before the fact by saying, if libidinal forces, we can use that as a stand-in. That's the word, I think. That's the phrase Freud uses, I believe. He describes it as libidinal forces. I think he uses that, or he calls it sexual instinctual forces. I think he also at least once says libidinal. He's at least speaking in terms of forces. So I'll call it libidinal forces. So like Freud is like, look, if the libido is constantly culminating in pleasure, this is a termination of the other things desire could achieve. And I think that actually puts him on Deleuze Guattari's side when they're arguing that pleasure is not the fulfillment of desire in any sense. It's the false terminating point of it that takes it away from its plateau, right? If you will.
Yeah. So here's where I was thinking libidinal economy and the example of the madam or the woman who takes pleasure in being debased, which is really like, I think we should maybe back up and just say that part of this, Freud develops this or articulates this theory of, and it's related again to sort of, we could even maybe sum it up as kind of like from the male sexuality perspective, the male heterosexual perspective, let's say, the mother, the wife act as they have a duality in terms of this, obviously, the sort of cliche Madonna horror complex where because of the way that Oedipus structures desire can have these unintended consequences of blocking the libidinal, like even when someone consciously desires or is attracted to another person, this subconscious falling back on the way that desire was structured for the infant becomes a challenge, becomes an obstacle to being able to fulfill the sexual act, because this lover is perceived, or sexual object is perceived to be one of these prohibited classes, a mother, a sister, etc. Right? And
this is the analytic stuff, right? That we are raised by our mother and father. Father protects us, mother cares for us. The care is erotically charged, and we develop attachments, fixations. That's Freud's going theory. And so our earliest sexuality is suffused with an incestuous, diagram or paradigm. And that's Freud's kind of, we make these object choices later in life without realizing it, where, we marry our mother, right? Is basically the stereotype of Freud, right? Anyway, that was just saying what you said in a kind of in a straightforward way to say Freud presupposes that incest, what he calls the barrier against incest, is part of that repulsion and attraction that he's trying, because he is thinking dynamically in terms of forces. He's thinking like, right. We are affectionate towards the women we choose to marry heterosexually, as you pointed out, heteronormatively. Men are attracted and are affectionate towards these women because of this resemblance. And I mean this not just obviously physically, but in terms of the sexual choices, object choices of their infantile sexuality. They're attracted to, they marry their mother, and so they already idealize them. And you brought all this up to say this is why Freud believes they have to debase. They have to overcome this affectionate current, this paradigm that reminds them of their mother, and debase the loved object in order to break the tie of the resemblance of the mother. Anyway,
it's like
basically what you were saying with the Madonna or paradigm. Yeah,
it's like a reverse sublimation, effectively, to where you take
Well, that's interesting.
the idealized object, and by debasing it, by making it, that's where, like, that's how you can manage this issue of sexual satisfaction with assuming, again, all this sort of presupposes from Freud's perspective that the Oedipus complex is this universal structuration of desire, which I don't know. I mean,
which we,
you know what I mean? Like,
we've spent a lot of time calling into question,
right? Yeah. It certainly feels like, I mean, it kind of, I don't know. It seemed like I can see where Freud's coming from, and maybe the issue is not so much that the Oedipus complex is not something that has effects, but is certainly it's in a specific historical and context, let's say, right?
So it's not universal.
Correct.
It's contingent.
Yeah. I mean, we see that as, when we looked at anti-Oedipus and the different ways and the different types of what the territorial primitive machine, yada, yada. Like those,
the different societal layouts, if you want to use a phrase that they don't use, but the different sociuses. And I guess the thing that Freud takes as an axiom is that incest is abhorred, whether it be psychologically, culturally, etc. Obviously, a combination of the two. And so, and because he does blame civilization for this, which does historicize it a little bit, right? And Freud even going a little bit against his universal paradigm, because he blames the man of today. I think that's one of his turns of phrase. He kind of says, like, look, the man of today can't help but fall into this trap unless they're very highly educated and rare, almost like a fucking superhero, because for Freud, there's these two currents. There's the affectionate, which we just talked about, right? We are affectionate towards our mother because she raised us and wiped our ass and fed us with her breast and all this, right? That's how we get the anacletic type of sexual orientation, where we desire our mother because we want this affection in our life. But Freud thinks, okay, now we need to combine that with the sensual current, which would be if we want to call it the lust, right? So we want to combine lust and love. We want to combine those two aspects of desire, one that wants to be, as you said, physically stimulated and satisfied in the sexual act. And Freud doesn't think typically civilization allows us to combine those two except in extraordinary circumstances, because who wants to fuck their mother, right? That's basically dumbing down his argument, but that's more or less where he's coming up with this paradox of how do we combine the affectionate and the sensual when the affectionate seems to presuppose a resemblance. And this is where obviously Deleuze would destroy this essay, because it's all based on a kind of resemblance paradigm. But anyway, it's this resemblance of the mother that ensures the affectionate, but at the same time dulls down even towards the sensual. I mean, I'm fucking my mother, and it's kind of awkward, right? I think that's like Freud's thing. I can't really get off here, or it's not really fun. I'm doing the sexual acts out of duty, but not for pleasure, right? Almost like this, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because I was, as far as the resemblance to the mother, because I was also thinking about Girard and mimetic desire in this way, and this kind of view, which is a more conservative view, which Freud kind of like is also, you could kind of see the logical connection as far as this notion of debasement, or this idea of the obstacle to love, the prohibition of incest itself being that which the prohibition itself is what intensifies the libido.
It intensifies it by finding another object rather than the one that reminds us of our mother, perhaps.
Oh, that's all right. That's interesting. Because I was thinking something along the lines of I guess you would say like mimetic desire, which even kind of falls into like basically what Lacan says about desire when he's speaking of desiring the other. Desire of the other, and or desiring to be the desire of the other. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking specifically in our current context about something like cuckoldry, which is, at least typically in our society, this is expressed by men who, by the kind of mechanism you can easily map out, drawing from Freud, would be that this additional lover, or really this Girard too, is like this additional lover that the woman experiences. That is what allows. So if, let's say, one is married, and so then that fucks with this Oedipal, like the Oedipal complex comes up to make the mother of our children, our wife, seem less desirable to us. So to deal with that blockage, that we actually introduce another lover, which becomes an perceived obstacle that heightens the libido of the husband for the wife or something like that. And you can kind of...
An obstacle, but also a vicarious substitute for oneself, it seems, right?
Right. Interesting. Okay. I didn't even think about
So
that aspect.
so you get to chant. That's part of the mimetism is, but also it seems very much so that at the same time you get the added benefit for Freud, if you would chime in, of you're also debasing your wife by literally watching her commit, adultery, right?
Yeah.
That's
because there's kind of like, so that complex also sort of, I think the example from libidinal economy of the madam or the who draws satisfaction from being debased as a mere object for sexual desire. And that even goes to the worker, interestingly too, because the famous quote, what is it, hold me close or hold me tight and spit on me, is the worker is being prostituted and fucked by capital, but they sort of embrace their own debasement in this
and take enjoyment from it.
Yeah, this kind of narcissistic, masochistic position, take enjoyment and say, yeah, use me for your whatever accumulation or etc. So it's interesting, the grander libidinal economy of this whole discussion, which I think just from this little paragraph, I think that's just kind of cool.
Yeah, because Lyotard, I believe he's looking at a Klosowski novel. I can't remember if it's Living Currency or if it's another novel. He's looking at how Madame Eduarda is subverting the paradigm of the prostitute is enjoying being paid for sex, and yet undercutting this paradigm, Madame Eduarda is taking pleasure from the act of sex itself when she's supposed to be enjoying the payment she receives. And so Lyotard takes that and runs with it, as you were saying. So I guess the one... Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say this kind of goes to anti-Oedipus in the way that, or like in the sense that the way that Oedipus structures desire, particularly from the male side, is about debasement and it is about power and domination in a way that I don't know, because like it's interesting, at least in our society, that like maybe it's just a practical blockage for this, but like the preponderance, at least maybe I don't have any like hard data to back this up, but it at least is perceived that the sort of cuckoldry is very overrepresented by males, versus women are less likely to have that the fantasy of their husband being with other women in a sense, or at least acting on that, or this being a fantasy that has wider purchase from the male perspective or from heteronormative male desire, yada yada.
Yeah, if we use Lacanian terms, the masculine position is generally of the cuckold, right? And so when women are in the position of being the cuckold, they are taking up the masculine position. I think Lacan's pretty good here, like in the sexuation diagram of not all women. When he has the diagram about castration, it's the masculine position and the feminine position, and their relationship with jouissance that at the very least complicates any sort of conservatism, like on Freud's part, where he's presupposing male, female, a sexual dimorphism in the basest sense. At the very least, Lacan is thinking of positions in the unconscious, if you will, which Freud would probably agree with. It's just that I almost feel like for expediency, or maybe there's a slight bit of laziness, or even just a slight bit of conventional wisdom that Freud is working with, that he falls back on male, female, when in fact he should be a little more careful. And I do think that Freud does show himself, as you said, to be conservative here. And if you recall, again, with our conversation with Charles Duval, we're discussing, Deleuze and Guattari give psychoanalysis in its beginnings, obviously talking about Freud, give Freud credit for untying the sexual act from reproduction. Freud's progressive there in asserting that if you only consider sexuality in terms of reproduction, you're never going to understand anything about symptom formation, or even what he's discussing here, psychical impotence, right? He has to take as an axiom that sexuality is not about reproduction in order to even formulate the fact that he said, I think Freud says in the first paragraph even, aside from the anxiety disorders, the main thing that people come to him for, or come to analysis for, is psychical impotence. Now, again, here he seems to be privileging the male perspective, but he does make an analogy to what he calls frigidity in women, which again feels like an outdated term. But Freud kind of does an asymmetrical thing, just like in whenever he discusses what you might call the Electra complex, right? Whenever he discusses the Oedipus complex for the feminine position, if you will, or for women, as he might say, for young girls, it's always asymmetrical. The different ways of going through the same thing for boys and girls. So for women, it's not the prohibition of incest so much as the prohibition of any sexual outlet at all that leads them to a stalemate, this deadlock of the forces of attraction and repulsion, where they finally are, so to speak, in a legitimate relationship, and yet they still have lingering this culturally imposed and presupposed prohibition against whether it be losing their virginity or debasing themselves by participating in sexual activity. Because Freud, again, shows himself to be conservative, and you still see this, my viewpoint, and conservative may not even be the right word, but he shows himself to be working on the level of common sense, on conventional, culturally accepted, patriarchal wisdom that prohibitions are on each side, but the boys, after puberty, are given license or leeway to constantly try to overcome these prohibitions. And obviously, overcoming the incest prohibition would not necessarily be going and fucking your mom, but taking that slight detour to find the appropriate substitute that would stand in for her while also being far enough away from her to allow for the sexual act to not result in failure. Impotence. So Freud takes it as an axiom that yes, boys are kind of expected to go out and do sexual conquest, whereas the girls are supposed to be holding back, which of course Freud acknowledging homosexuality would be like, well, who are all these boys fucking if all the girls are remaining chaste? In any case.
Yeah. I mean, that definitely, I thought of also, just broadly speaking, I thought about, ancient Greece and the older man and the younger male, and how the wife plays into that for reproductive love, but for as far as like actual erotic love, it was the younger male who was really the sexual object, which kind of is an interesting. I mean, I had proposed a long time ago in one of the discussions that this was a way that the ancient Greeks would deal with Oedipus itself, and this kind of, I think, in the way, and from the perspective of the younger male, and that relationship to the father per se, or the stand-in for the father.
Or on the other hand, if the wife is the anaclitic relation type, reminding us of her mother, and that's why the love is more of a love of creating a home, as you said, for reproduction. The love of an older male and a younger boy, what if it weren't anaclitic, and now it's not about sort of a father relationship? What if it's a narcissistic relationship? Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's the other side of it too. Yeah, for sure.
The younger boy that I once was, I love, right? I see the youth and virility that I once had in my youth. I see reflected myself in this young man that I'm taking as my lover.
Yeah, who I'm also I'm free to. This may be more Roman than Greek per se. I don't know. I'm just, maybe that's just popular culture, but I think the debasement element of male heteros, whatever normative desire to, right? Because it's like, oh, I can't have sex with my wife. She's an idealized object for procreation only. Like, it's this, not a sublimation, but I don't know. What would the opposite of sublimation be in that sense? I guess that isn't really, it's not. I guess debasement is the opposite of sublimation. So, but I'm getting myself tangled up.
I guess
theoretically here.
I feel like debasement is the opposite of what Freud is calling overvaluation, or elsewhere he'll call idealization.
Idealization, right? Yeah.
Freud talks about men are prone to overvalue the women whom they have affection for. And this seems to correspond with the height of respect and love and value we place in our mother, right? I think that's Freud's analogy, right?
Yeah.
And so in order to overcome that mother resemblance, we have to debase. And but the thing is, Freud points out very clearly that there's a class element to all of this, which is why in Anti-Oedipus, they're like, hey, if you're going to write a dissertation on psychoanalysis, it's best not to take up these overly broad categories, such as, the development of psychosexual histories and etc., but actually look at the role of nurses and maids and midwives in Freud's case histories. We've talked a lot about this in the Rat Man story, because honestly, psychical impotence can be found in the Rat Man in the way in which his father's expecting him to marry this woman of good standing who is wealthy. And of course, Rat Man is drawn towards these women of lower station, or the Wolf Man and the episodes that he recounts with the different, for example, the way that Freud renders it is the Wolf Man at a young age whips out his penis and pees on the rug, not necessarily in order to give his wet nurse something to do, but as though as a means of seduction, right? Of seducing his caregiver, who is not his mother, who is. So this whole issue of class and Freud, the way that he brushes by it in this show, obviously it's all very condensed and it's a short paper, but the way that he's like, oh yeah, men of higher standings, they will they as a rule will take as a mistress someone from a lower social station. And Freud just seems to he does it. See, that's the thing. Deleuze and Guattari are like, hey, look at class in Freud. Look at class in Freud's writings, in his case histories. Look at the women that are actually doing the child rearing and raising in the Wolf Man. It's not the mother. So this whole presupposition of loving the woman who raised me and cared for me and etc. In the Wolfman history, it's very clear that that's not the mother is already substituted for before incest comes into play. So this is why Freud's very clear when he talks about incest. It's not necessarily the biological, literal mother. It's the mother or her substitute, whoever played the role.
Yeah, it's the position. Yeah, the position of caregiver itself, which is, I was thinking the act of pissing on the rug is like the act of micturating on your fucking rug. Would
really
be,
tie the room together.
Would be, and you know what I mean? Interestingly, here, this is an act of, this is a territorial show of power.
Yes.
Which goes to the sort of my kind of thesis of the way that, not really my thesis. Maybe this is one of the broader theses of Anti-Oedipus itself, is the way that the Oedipal relationship or paradigm structured desire is one that is inherently fascist because it implies dominance and power, right? It implies debasement, accepting this as a truth debases, this debasement must be achieved. That's the fetish of bringing someone down a peg, let's say, becomes the way that heteronormative desire is driven. And obviously that itself is certainly, at least from some, or to some extent, would reinforce the patriarchy, the domination of women's bodies and the flows of semen and children and what have you, reproduction itself, reproduction of societies.
Well, you called into question, and I think rightfully so, that I said in passing, it wasn't necessary. He could be trying to seduce her and debase her at the same time, because he knows because the Wolfman, obviously, even though his family lost their wealth after the war or during the First World War, at the time that Freud is recounting this scene of the Wolfman pissing on the rug in front of his maid or whatever, his caregiver maid, then he was doing it as a show of power, that you got to clean this shit up, right? You are my servant. Yeah, maybe I spoke a little too quickly there.
Another interesting phenomenon to look at this from multiple perspectives is something like, I think, the predominance or the way that the fetishization of anal sex, which, as we know, is the anus is the first organ to be privatized. So that alone provides a certain, this fits into this model that Freud is talking about relative to debasement or mediation, if we're going Girard, where it's the repulsion of the anus itself is what makes it desirable in terms of libidinal intensity, which we've all, obviously Deleuze and Guattari, Lyotard are speaking against this kind of thing, and desire being a lot more free-flowing and less deterministic than that. But I don't know. It's just kind of another example. I think even a foot fetish falls in the similar kind of vein where a foot is sort of, I don't know, I'm repulsed by feet to some extent for whatever reason. And that, so it's
and we've talked about fetish formation.
It's precisely
before.
the repulsion of the object that gives it its libidinal charge to some extent. So
but the other thing I would say about the anus, not just because you did bring up First to Be Privatized, but Freud and when he writes about childhood theories of sexuality, brings about the idea that and this ties into fetish formation, right? If the foot is the last thing one sees before realizing your mother is castrated, in Freud's term, doesn't have a penis, doesn't have a member. Childhood theories of sexuality, when Freud writes about this, often includes this idea that there is a cloaca, right? Rather than a vagina and an anus, there's one hole for defecating, for sexual activity, for birth, etc. He spends at least a paragraph or two writing about this cloaca theory of childhood sexuality. And I think that's when Deleuze Guattari, they kind of make an allusion to this, if you will, but through Artaud instead of Freud, where they kind of, I think in that same area, Anti-Oedipus in chapter 3, where they're like, yeah, wouldn't it be better if we just had one hole, not even like sexual hole, but like one hole to eat out of, to shit out of, to breathe out of, to fuck with, just obviously gesturing towards the body without organs. But
yeah, I guess that's kind of interesting, the way that the notion of like the foot fetish itself, I don't know, in contrast, or maybe not even in contrast, but like thinking about it through the lens of the body without organs becomes quite interesting. And I think in itself maybe breaks the hierarchical assertion of reproduction as the tied to desire, or that you were articulating much more clearly than I tried to there. But I think we may have even
Freud's
said that
clear.
before, right?
Yeah, Freud's very clear. Like, and Zizek hammers this home better than anyone. But Freud's very clear. It's like, look, the pervert doesn't want the whole woman. The worst thing for their pleasure is getting the whole woman or the whole object. They want just the part. Just give me the part, and that's all I need.
I mean, in itself, that kind of complicates this notion of courtly love as this transcendent relationship too, because it's like the lady's favor is a part object, right? That becomes whatever the sexual desire gets displaced onto the object, or what the fuck ever. It's like continuous edging without culmination, which itself brings into that also points to desire and its relation to reproduction not necessarily having such a clear-cut one-to-one relationship. Maybe I'm just repeating shit.
No, I mean,
man, there was something else that Deleuze said that I fucking wish I could remember. I had it and I kind of like lost it, but hopefully it'll come back to me. I don't want to derail us too much while I ruminate on that. What do you think about, though, this idea of reaction formation at the cultural or at the social level? Whenever, let's say, libidinal economy gets too out of whack from the sort of conservative perspective, to where, okay, sexual gratification is, society's become too permissive. Sexual gratification can be achieved with little effort, or without this mediation, without the obstacles. So there has to be some sort of revolution, or there has to be some new libidinal regime put in place to restrict the flows of libido, so that so that love and relationships so that social bonds per se, maybe even, can flourish in a way that whenever sexual satisfaction is too easily obtainable, then that spells disaster for society. And that's kind of the implication of what is going on here. And this, I think, would fall into Girard's theory very, neatly, and maybe even to some extent Lacan from a certain perspective. It's hard to, Lacan sort of wishy-washy here, I think, sometimes advocating for this. I mean, similar in like the desire of the other, like that certainly goes to a mimetic desire, and this notion of like, the mediator too, just as far as desire is concerned, right? It's like there's a sort of there's that triangular relation, or like the sexuation digraph, which I guess has quadrants or something of that nature, but I'm rambling a bit.
No, I think this is interesting because Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols, I think it's Twilight, I'd have to double check, writes about how only in the modern era was the institution of marriage supposedly founded on love rather than different lineages forming alliances, for example,
Right.
whether it be through arranged marriage or whatever else kind of cultural institutions to regulate the marriages of, and therefore the creation of alliances between households and stuff like this, right? So like Nietzsche's whole idea is if marriage is no longer without the foundation that it institutionally and historically has had, then what does that tell us about the institution of marriage, right? That's just kind of like, that's how he ends his thought experiments. Like what, not just why even have marriage, which is a valid question, because without its foundation in the forming of alliances, if it's formed on love, then doesn't it irrevocably change? And so, I do think that in that sense, I mean, that's kind of like the impetus of the drama behind Romeo and Juliet, as hackneyed and overdone as it might be. The whole real motivations behind the story is this: instead of two houses wanting to form alliances, they would rather have blood feud. They're at the diametrical opposite of wanting to come together and form alliances.
Yeah, which I will interject my one Dune reference, unplanned completely, but so this is right in the breeding program of the Bene Gesserit, where they want to wed Duke Leto's daughter, presumably, to Fade Routha, who is the heir Baron Harkonnen, right? So in order to become a familial alliance, the Jessica Paul's mother was ordered to bear a daughter so that relation, that blood feud could be sealed off like that, so that both families, the bloodlines could continue on, etc. Right? So just another literature example to back up this, which I just had that thought of in terms of the way that this sort of, what would you call it, a sort of feudalistic way of dealing with marriage versus a more, like, as we move into capitalism, there's a deterritorialization that goes on with its subsequent, obviously, the reterritorialization is that this serves capital accumulation ultimately and the transition of like private property as the ultimate, I think. To me, maybe that's a bold statement, but marriage serves to the main purpose is its relationship to private property.
Yeah. And I mean, this is why Deleuze Guattari refer to Kant's definition of marriage as ownership of another individual's genitals. Now, Kant is obviously not saying this is his idea. He's putting this in the context of Roman law, right? Roman law considering marriage as ownership. Obviously, the man owning the woman's genitals. But in any case, that's only insofar as filiation is supposedly tied to the, as you mentioned, the passing on of not just name, but property. But I guess that's the thing. Owning your wife's genitals, including her uterus and reproductive system as a whole, means that whatever comes out through it would supposedly be yours. I guess Freud does mention in this, and even in his day, right, before DNA samples, it's pretty obvious who the mother of a child is, but one can never be fully certain of the biological paternity. And that veil of mystery is a source of contention at the very least, right? In any case, I know that gets us a little bit off topic, but it's kind of tied to this question of psychical impotence. The question of Oedipus isn't just who is my mother, whom I desire, but also who is my father, who I murder.
Yeah.
Oedipus is left in the dark about that.
And how does one see, that's the murder of the father is like, maybe that's the implication. That's the fascistic aspect of Oedipus is like, but then again, I guess this sort of gets sublimated by this like conflict, rivalry between the father and the child for the mother's love. Like, I don't know how to necessarily articulate that. Because I even think, to me, it's like, I think the reverse aspect of where, let's say, the father actually is the one who instigates the Oedipal relationship and his jealousy over the child usurping the attention of the mother. And then Oedipus being in the mind of the father, which kind of tracks too, because you've got to have sort of maybe you would presuppose a sort of source. So to recapitulate for you, Taylor, since you had a power outage there for a second. So I was just going in the direction of that notion that Oedipus starts in the mind of the father. And I don't know, just as an interesting maybe counterpoint or jumping off for further discussion, as far as the father's resentment of the child's usurpation of the mother's affection, that being the source of the antagonism between father and son or father and child or what have you, right? And that being where the father's even unconscious ambivalence toward the child being the source of the, you know what I mean? It's almost like you often see like children want to live up, or particularly, I guess the cliche is male children want to live up to the image of their father, right? Like they have reverence for the father,
yes,
and so forth, and so they want to please the father in a way that, like, I guess there's also the pleasing of the mother too is certainly comes into that, but you don't see, I don't know, I guess cliche again. The mother is perceived always as being the more understanding of the two, and the father being the one that wants to push the son or the child to achieve, or like the child has this image of the father that they want to live up to. They want to fulfill the role, which maybe that's not as anti-Oedipal as I was thinking initially when I started bringing up the way that.
Well, the father imposes order, and therefore the barrier that you brought up earlier to our forces.
Yeah,
and so we have to overcome that barrier. Now, on the one hand, that can be imposing order and barrier to us settling for achieving less. But the other barrier, obviously, the incest barrier that Freud presupposes, the father imposes the barrier of precluding us from obtaining our first, so to speak, in Freud's paradigm, desired object, which is the mother, which is what you also said.
Oh, the Deleuze thing that I was thinking about earlier actually just came back to mind, and it was about something about extending sympathy, right? Doesn't he?
Okay.
I forget what text it is, but he makes some mention of that which is close to us and that which is far away, and extending our sympathies beyond that which is close to us. And I was even thinking, tying this to,
it's between being on the left and being on the right.
That little sort of circular graph where I think the implications being that conservatives tend to have more sympathy for those of a closer proximity, and the left is kind of the reverse, where those further away from our proximity, the greater distance from us, we extend our sympathies there, at least in a way that is equally or to those that are near us. And just thinking about this in terms of the Oedipal, or not the Oedipal, but the prohibition, right? Because the prohibition of incest is to distance us in terms of our libido and those that are near to us.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it just raises kind of an interesting question in this dynamic and this view of society, the conservative position versus, I don't know, the more, the Deleuze Guattari, Lyotard, etc., where desire is not so, I guess, deterministic, and the recognition of like Oedipus itself as this historically constituted way that libidinal economy is addressed within societies.
Mm-hmm. No, this is good. I would have to think about this because I don't have an immediate answer that to except for the fact that Freud always thinks about these unconscious libidinal forces as having to undertake detours. If you recall, the pleasure principle is supposedly like the straight line between desire and its fulfillment. I shouldn't say desire because I might be confusing, but if the pleasure principle is meant to take desire to extinguish itself in pleasure, we already talked about Deleuze Guattari said this is how to kill desire in its imminent process. But for Freud, you got the pleasure principle, which is a basic economic understanding of the unconscious, where pressure builds up, libidinal forces find fulfillment, discharge, and through an object and obtain satisfaction, and that reduces the pressure, right? But Freud is also interested in the fact that things don't, in reality, to use his term, in reality, things don't really go that way. And so there's a reality principle. Now, the reality principle for Freud is actually an extension of the pleasure principle, because the whole idea being there are these detours, these paths around, there's an obstacle in the way of that straight line to fulfillment, satisfaction, and the detours taken, in fact, are still in the end aiming at the satisfaction that the pleasure principle was also guaranteeing us, but we have to take these detours. And through these detours, we actually, in the end, come out with a surplus value. That may not be his word for it, but we come out with, if to speak in a Lacanian way, surplus jouissance. We actually get more pleasure in the end through the reality principle. It's just a delayed gratification. There's obviously Freud's very keen on this notion of delay.
Or edging.
Yeah, right.
Which is interesting in that presumes, I mean, we talked about, I think it was it an acute act where I think it was Amy that was saying like the act of like there's a very sort of feminine jouissance element to gooning, and like because there's not it almost goes to courtly love too, right? It's not predicated on this aim or goal, like ultimately, like it's about
the goal is not to fuck the beloved.
It's the journey. It's not about the destination. It's about the journey and so forth, and like really heightening. I mean, become really like. Gooning is kind of making yourself a body without organs. Like it's right. It's like you're driving up intensity. You're exploring sensations and heightening forces and flows.
I mean, the way that Lacan talks about feminine jouissance as one of the faces of God, and he thinks about it as not necessarily being terminating in orgasm in the way that we think about it for males. There's a way in which the feminine jouissance that he talks about in Seminar 20 is much closer to the way Deleuze and Guattari describe desire as a plateau, right? It's not meant to terminate and culminate in some sort of orgasmic climax that then reduces the tension and the elevation of desire, which is why pleasure is in fact the enemy for their conception of it. So yeah, I mean, So yes, plateau is supposedly from Bateson's terminology, but it has a Lacanian aspect in that sense of feminine jouissance.
Yeah, I've often wondered, like one of my own little like harebrained theses is that like some aspect or elements of misogyny is due to jealousy of a woman's ability to like have multiple orgasms. I mean, that's really reductively Freudian, but I don't know. I feel like that to me, maybe it's simplistic, but I've often had that thought that there's some type of, because I think also the other side of that too, or one that I think we've even maybe mentioned was male jealousy over the fact that they can't give birth.
They can't create life, not in the sense in which we historically have been able to,
right.
We as a species.
Exactly.
And that is maybe less apparent in the Oedipus myth and drama, the Sophoclean drama, more apparent in the myth of Cronus and Rhea, right? Cronus is told by an oracle that one of his sons is going to overthrow him. So he swallows his first two sons, Poseidon and Hades, and it's the third one that Rhea, obviously he was distracted, switches Zeus out with the stone, swaddles it cloth and hands it over. Cronus swallows the stone instead of Zeus. And of course, over time, Zeus does come and kill his father. In variations of the story, he castrates him, throws his genitals into the sea. From the foam, Aphrodite is born, and which is interesting for the goddess of love and beauty to be born from patricide and castration.
That's really interesting. That's fascinating, actually. I like that a lot.
I mean, the so much of the symbolics that we could spend a whole hour talking about just that. But
yeah.
But one of the things is, first of all, it shows, just like with Oedipus, and as you said, mentioning Deleuze and Guattari, does Oedipus begin in the mind of the son as a neurotic, or does it begin in the mind of a paranoid father? So again, with the knowledge of foresight, the oracle could just be the knowledge of the wisdom of age and the way in which generation comes after generation, right? I mean, it could be just as banal as that. But in any case, so it begins in the mind of a paranoid father, just like with Laius in the Oedipus story. It's Cronus and the myth of Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon. And the swallowing of the child, or swallowing the children after they're born, adds in that extra element, as you mentioned, of this jealousy of the mother's capacities for birth. And so in a certain sense, the father in this myth, Cronus, the Titan emperor, is very much like the body without organs of the despot, right? The way in which Cronus appropriates all and doesn't create. The despot doesn't create, but he appropriates everything. He acts as the quasi-cause, to use their language. And of course, when we in Plato's Symposium, when Socrates learns the art of love from Diotima, he appropriates this knowledge of philosophy, the love of wisdom, but restricts it for the impregnation of young boys, of young men with philosophy, right? So he takes this paradigm learned from a woman. So Plato is at least inscribing in his own story the fact that Socrates learns philosophy from a woman, but restricts it for men. So like there is a kind of interesting way of pointing back to woman while canceling her out or excluding her, in the same way that the Symposium begins by excluding all of the female servants and performers that were there to entertain. No, this is just for us men, right? We're about to do philosophy. This is just for us men. No women, no girls allowed. Plato is at least keen enough in that aspect to point to what he's appropriating and canceling it out at the same time.
I was thinking too about Jacob and Esau. I mean, that goes back to the kind of paranoiac father, the anxiety over offspring and like private property and so forth being transferred to the eldest son, right? Because it's the mother. What's the mother in the story? I forget who Isaac's wife was. Was it Rachel?
Oh, no. Jacob married Leah and Rachel.
Gotcha. So she conspires with Jacob to take.
Okay, I don't remember her name, but I had forgotten this aspect. Okay,
so she conspired because she dresses up Jacob in the
goat skin,
goat skin, so that his furry. So it's it's really interesting the dynamic.
Esau was a hairy motherfucker.
Exactly, it's interesting the dynamic. The mother. Why does the mother prefer the younger son over Esau?
Well, Jacob is. I guess it could be as simple as Jacob is in the lineage leading through David to Jesus, right? Jacob is.
Yeah, but I mean, by definition, if Esau is the son of Isaac, and
Esau is the firstborn, isn't he?
I think they have the same. I think they have the same mother.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken. So it's just. It's kind of I wonder what's the dynamic? What's the kind of source of this aspect of this kind of mythological narrative here, where the mother prefers the younger son, other than maybe like the what the youngest child usually is kind of treated in a different. I don't know. Like I wonder if the youngest. Is it as simple as that?
Even though he's younger by minutes, right? Because seconds. Right? Isn't he like holding on to Esau's heel?
I'm googling this now, so if you have something to.
Yeah, and also too, Isaac at the end is blind, which we know is symbolic of castrated and blah blah blah. I don't want to go into that, but
Rebecca was Isaac's wife, so I was close. I said Rachel, but it's Rebecca.
I should have remembered that. I don't know why I didn't remember that. I don't know why.
So yeah, Rebecca is definitely the mother of the. And so they are twins. Jacob and Esau are twins. Rebecca is the mother.
And you remember Abraham's first son is not.
Right, Ishmael with Hagar, the Egyptian handmaid.
Yeah,
which is sort of goes to the debasement element too.
Debasement.
Well. Like one wonder, there's an interesting kind of relation to this whole going back to the essay itself and Freud's kind of conservative notion of sexual libidinal energy and debasement, and sort of the mother being like the sort of transcendence of the mother as this idealized figure versus obviously the handmaid. I mean, that goes back to the discussion you brought up relative to the rat man the Wolfman, etc., and Freud, and this sort of class issue, the sort of the caregiver role of.
And here, it's not just class. It's not just class too. It's also this question of lineage.
Yeah,
that the God tells Abraham, "Is it your seed is going to outnumber the stars?" Something like this, right? Promising him this when Abraham wasn't able to have child with Sarah. Yeah, I mean, I do think that as for why Rebecca, I mean, one of the things you mentioned, yes, younger son, again, they're very close. But the other thing too is upending the convention of the eldest, and the eldest is supposed to inherit the birthright. So she could be doing, and the other thing too is, and this I think this will become more apparent when we read the nomadology chapter in 1,000 Plateaus. Jacob's terrified later on because he also tricks Esau, right? He kind of takes advantage of him, I think, right? Doesn't he? Like Esau's like coming to him starving, and he trades his birthright or trades something for a bowl of stew.
That definitely comes into play, but I can't remember
in any case, like later, Esau is a very interesting figure because he leads like not an army, but he leads like a whole band of fighters and warriors. So Jacob is worried that Esau is going to take revenge on him, and of course, it turns out differently. But just thinking about these books of the Old Testament and the question of let's say like the war machine, right? So Esau is a part of this war machine, and I think that will be interesting to revisit when we get there. But I don't have much more to add.
Yeah, so you're right. It was there was an issue where Esau was hungry. He was like on the verge of starvation, and so the trade with Jacob is he offers them a bowl of stew in exchange for his birthright, which quells, I suppose, the conflict there ultimately, which is really interesting.
Quells it. It would begin it. You mean?
Yeah.
What do you mean by quells? I was thinking Jacob isn't like later. He knows he's taking advantage of his brother. So I thought like
he's
later,
definitely
maybe that's why Esau goes off, because now he's lost his birthright, and that's how he becomes a part of this war machine. He's taken in.
Random bit of trivia is that after this event, Esau becomes known as Edom, Edom, meaning red.
Oh,
because the stew was red. Esau became known as Edom, meaning red. So I wonder that's kind of interesting.
So he's reminded of being cheated by his twin brother.
Well, it's like interesting because of like the blood,
say his name.
right? The blood sort of like,
okay.
I guess you know what I mean? In terms of lineage, I don't know. There's also like
blood.
There's a lot of difference. I was thinking maybe that's kind of the tie, but I don't know. There's probably like a million different ways you could read the significance of that.
Okay.
But I don't know if there's any more necessity of going down that rabbit hole.
No, and I think we've discussed the text in a fun way. That we went off on a couple of other tracks that was cool. That was fun.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess the last thing I would really just mention is the notion that Christianity was able to manage love and turn it into give it psychical value, give it a transcendent value in a manner that paganism couldn't. And so maybe, which I don't know. I mean, that kind of like it goes in a very conservative direction there, because it's like this like accounts for the stability of Christianity, is like the sort of emergent property of the transcendent nature of Christianity itself is what provides a certain stability, not only of its own reproduction, but why it persists is because it lends itself like this sort of unintended consequence of this religious structure. And this is the conservative position, really, is like ultimately this is kind of this would be like the Jordan Peterson reading, right? It's like, well, it's not so much that Christianity is the truth in this sort of way that most people try to assume Christianity has truth. It has truth in its ability to create a stable reproduction of society without things erupting into violence and disunity and discontinuity, which Girard, I think, is also like...
That's the Girardian... Yeah, that's the Girardian reading. Gotcha. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just... It's interesting in the context of this kind of this divergence between Nietzsche, who ironically Peterson himself also like he looks to Nietzsche as a figure of he has reverence for Nietzsche, but so I think Nietzsche would be an antagonist largely to what Peterson is doing here,
and to Christianity in general. He would probably not agree with, or he would ironically agree with Freud about infusing these psychical values into love and all this. He would scoff at it.
Yeah. Then I wonder, like, then it becomes that the interesting notion. I don't know if we have time, or I don't have the ability to really square the circle with regard to like love and infinite debt and Oedipus, as far as the idea is that this ambivalence from the child's perspective is due to our helplessness, the long period of gestational helplessness we have as infants and so forth. And so we accumulate this debt for our own existence that obviously we cannot pay, and how that certainly like mirrors our relationship to Christ and his sacrifice for us that gives us eternal life. I don't know, just an interesting, I don't know. Again, I don't know how to maybe fully.
Well, the infinite debt for Freud, the infinite debt to our parents is
Right.
internalized, turned into a guilt mechanism that we call the superego, right? That's supposed to set boundaries and barriers, like we talked about earlier. The incest barrier.
Okay. Yeah.
And then for Nietzsche, obviously, yes, you're right. Now, the word guilt and debt in German, Schuld, is the same word, right? So this infinite guilt is infinite debt. And Nietzsche, this is how Nietzsche would agree with Freud while subverting him, ironically, is that the infinite debt we have for existing, as you mentioned, God out of love, through this infinite love, sacrifices himself for his debtor. And Nietzsche, using the Latin, says, can one credit that? Can we believe this myth of redemption?
Yeah. So it's interesting too there that there's a debasement that occurs relative to the idealized and the sacrifice or the object of love too, with regard to, because the Father God rejects in a certain, like, he turns his back on Christ on the cross, because, he says, Christ says,
why hast thou forsaken me?
Yeah,
my God, my God.
Exactly. Eloi, Eloi, sabachthani, yada, yada. My shittiest Hebrew there, or not even Hebrew. Maybe it's Aramaic. I don't know. Greek, yada, yada. But so it's interesting.
I think he's supposedly speaking in Greek, I believe.
Yeah. It's just interesting that through line of the sacred and the profane, right? Or what's Girard's book? Was it the sacred and the one?
Violence and the sacred.
Violence and the sacred, right? So there's there's an interesting thing going on there too, relative to debasement and the notion that for a sacrifice to have the right, like, libidinal charge, it's got to be like, it has to be this figure of like the son of God, the son of the king, the son of whomever, Isaac, for example, with Abraham and Isaac and the sacrifice, right? The sacrifice has to have value, right? It can't be too easily, right? It can't be something that you don't give a fuck about, right? Like, which kind
of... It has to suspend the teleological ethical, as Kierkegaard says.
So it's interesting that it kind of mirrors the sexual relationship that Freud articulates regarding love objects and the divine and the feminine and the sort of base.
So the debased object is the scapegoat for the libidinal overcoming of...
But can only be like, it's like the mother has to be debased. It would have to be the mother that would have to be debased in the relationship.
Well, it's not the mother, but it's whomever we've chosen.
Sure, the idealized, right?
The idealized. The idea of the mother has to be wiped away from the sexual object. Yeah.
But that's the converse. It's the reverse. It's like it's the importance, the significance of the prince or the son or whomever. Like, if we're going back, even like that, if we're going back to Moses and monotheism, right? Where Moses was escaped from, it's because he kind of reverses the story, right? Where it's always like, we hear the apocryphal story is that Moses's mother puts him in the ark to save him from...
Sends him downriver, yeah.
But to save him from the king, where I think Freud's kind of thesis was, okay, he was actually a prince that was escaping this sort of the sort of sacrificial element that had predated later, I suppose. Like this, and I think he even draws the connection to this in Isaac's story directly, like there being this older tradition of infanticide and the firstborn son obviously having a supreme libidinal value in this context due to lineage and blah, 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 right? I don't know. That's all I really had to say.
And the two Moseses, one was put to death, and then the guilt and the superego grew, and that's when the second Moses... so you can easily do a Girardian reading of Moses and monotheism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
I think we definitely...
Freud
got all into that in some of those episodes.
That was about the same time that we were doing the Girard. So
fascinating stuff. It's funny how one little paragraph really, that's they've spent about an hour and a half overall looking at. But I don't know. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add? I think we've kind of travailed all the ground I really wanted to cover.
No, I think it's been good. It's been good that, like you said, I mean, we used one paragraph to jump off of, but we did cover most of the 6, 7, 8 pages. So still, like, a very short essay by Freud can easily lead to discussing not just a lot of things that he himself theorizes elsewhere, but these other theoretical works that we've studied. So that was good. I'm glad. It was a nice little crystal, a nice little gem.
That will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. We'll see you all next week.
The very rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.